82% of team members feel misunderstood or undervalued. So this is exactly where I like to be, teaching, communicating, helping others, realizing their aspirations. I'm so excited about shattering the glittering image and uncovering the truth about you.
Welcome back to the Intrepid Impact Leadership Show here on YouTube. I'm Jerry Howard, your host, your executive performance coach, business consultant, and certified jail inspector. And if you don't know what that means, check out our previous episodes, because I spend an episode talking about what it takes to actually become a certified jail inspector. And here at the Intrepid Impact Leadership Channel, we sit at the intersection of faith, leadership, and business. And to us, those are as inseparable as Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. So what are you going to find out today? Faith, leadership, and business, and how they intersect. And what I'm so excited about sharing with you is a friend, mentor, and our guest today. His name is Steve Cockram. And if you haven't met or heard of him, you can find him easily on LinkedIn. But let me give you some background on him. I know Steve as the personality Yoda. A lot of people in the world might know him as an international performance consultant, but he's also a best-selling author and has previously been a pastor as well. So I can't think of anybody that epitomizes faith, leadership, and business than Steve Cockram. Steve, welcome to the show, man.
Jerry, thank you. I always love, as a Brit, my American introductions are truly one of life's great moments. It's always embarrassing. You kind of think if Jesus rocked up, it would be a disappointment for the audience, but you actually mean it. And that's the bit I love about you Americans. You genuinely want people to do well. So thank you. It's a joy to be with you. Nice to meet everyone. I hope this is going to be helpful.
Absolutely, yeah. And I think it will be. You know, we've spent a lot of time on this show talking about the tools that GiANT, of course, you were the co-founder for, created. They really produced the content that I thought so valuable to invest the time and resources in a YouTube channel for all the viewers. So Steve is actually the author of many of these tools. One in particular that I think is foundational is the 5 Voices. And so Steve, I'd love for our viewers here to learn a little bit more about your background, and then you can progress into the GiANT story.
Good. Well, I mean, what am I now? Gosh, I'm nearly 53 next week, Jerry, so I hope my present's on the way. I've been married to Helen. We'll be married for 31 years this summer. We have 3 girls who are 22, 18, and 11, but they're all coming up another year. And in terms of background, what would be helpful to know? I grew up basically in an environment. That's my silly dog, by the way. He wants to come and sit under and be in the podcast. So there we go. She'll sit there happily now. So I grew up in the most loving home possible. Wow. My parents are the most amazing people, but they've never left their small town. They never will. They're nurturers in our language. And I was, if anything, overloved. But nobody had a clue how the world worked, let alone how to deal with someone with the entrepreneurial kind of drive and talent. So career advice for me was virtually non-existent, Jerry. I went and did whatever anybody said was a good thing to do. I was a teacher. I was a pastor. I ran a nightclub. It took years really to work out that actually what was in me, faith had always been a huge part of that. But it was a bit like going, all my friends who were keen Christians growing up, they all either ended up as headmasters or principals of school or pastors. Nobody went into business. And I think kind of, the hybrid for me was I went from realizing I was too impatient as a pastor. Things didn't change fast enough, and I would wear people out looking back. And then basically I ended up coaching, consulting, came over to America in 2007, lived over in your wonderful country for 5 years, visited more states than most Americans have ever been to, working purely as a consultant coach with church leaders, denominational leaders, large nonprofits, learned so much about that piece. And then 10 years ago now, moved back to the UK. And of course, there's no economic engine for working with churches in Europe as a consultant coach. And I guess also thought I probably have done everything it's possible to know about helping church leaders. And so therefore the vision was, well, could we take what we'd learned? And with a friend of mine, co-founder Jeremy Kubicek, who'd really been doing this a lot more intentionally than I had for a lot longer, could we take the things we've learned and actually engage with the spheres of culture beyond the world of church? So that's really the journey of how we got to the GiANT piece. But bit of background, hopefully that's helpful. Live just outside London now, 20 minutes from Heathrow, and feel very privileged really to be able to do something I love with people I care deeply about.
That's fascinating. I love that you said that, because if you're in business and leadership particularly, ultimately I think the goal, and Steve, I think you do this great with the GiANT London team, is creating a family environment. And if you recognize the tendencies of each leadership voice and of people in general, and you're okay with that and get okay with that, then you can create that family environment. I think, again, what I've seen of GiANT London, you guys are definitely a family.
Well, I think this is where I'm going to get a bit nerdy, and it's very rare I'm allowed to talk about this sort of stuff, Joe. But if you look at the earliest expression of church, which is a poor translation, by the way, of the word ecclesia. Church is a 12th century German construct, but let's leave it there. Ecclesia was basically a gathering of the elders of the city who would sit in the gate of the city to contend for the good of the city in its economic, social, spiritual, educational well-being. That's what the original intent of that word ecclesia was. And effectively, a lot of the time, we as sort of faith leaders are often withdrawn to the margins, and church tends to have campuses. But the one that you just described there, that those words in Romans 16, where most people love Romans and then stop at Romans 15, because the last chapter is all about, and greet Jerry of the household of, or greet so-and-so who's the sister of so-and-so of the church that meets in their home. But the word that's translated poorly as church there is oikos. And an oikos was a household of faith. All the early churches that we read about in the New Testament were not big gatherings with steeples and big campuses, because it was too dangerous. They were all built around extended families, and those extended families had an economic engine at the center of their family business. And that's basically, whether it was Lydia, who's the dealer in, purple cloth and kind of haute couture sort of finance, or whether it was Peter or whatever it was around the fishing, or John with his wine business, you'll find that all the households that are referenced in the New Testament, interestingly, had an economic business engine, which allowed them to have the space for both their, biological family, but slaves were not really slaves in kind of southern, chattel slavery. They were more servants or employees of the household. Yeah. And the thing that blows me away, Jerry, is that when you do the study on this, when you'd been a servant of the household of the business for long enough, and you were technically able to be free, you chose to become a bond servant, which is, I become part of the family for good. And they would often set that person with money to set up a franchise of the business in another place. So if you think that entrepreneurial, faith-based endeavor, that's what early church was for 300 years before Constantine came along and basically then declared Christianity the empire religion, and basically gave it buildings, tax breaks, and have a guess what happened after that. Men appeared on the scene, power dynamics became embedded. But for years and years and years, business created the context for oikos, the extended family on mission together, where an educational, spiritual, religious, economic dynamic works. So when you come and meet GiANT London, for those of you who ever come over, come and say hi. We actually have a version of it, because a number of families work together. We share a common economic interest, and I guess Helen and I sit at the center as a mother and father figure. And obviously Becky and Tim, that work very closely with us in that. And around us there is an orbit of 3, 12, 72, in the same way that Jesus had. And that's not saying we're trying to be Jesus. It's trying to say we've just assumed he was better at doing this. But whenever you read mother and father in the Bible, we tend to think of that now as nuclear family. The nuclear family is a relatively new construct of really the 20th century. For the whole of human history before, nobody read father or mother and thought nuclear family. They all thought extended family that was both blood and through people who worked with and for the family. So, hey, forgive me if I sound like a pastor. I alternate between the two, but I go, if you are building a business and you have an economic engine that allows you to employ people, create opportunities for people, you are actually building something which is much closer to the New Testament oikos than the large church down the road. So anyway, there we go. And of course, the oikoses all went to synagogue, or they went to Jerusalem a few times a year for massive festivals, but the primary expression of faith and belonging was in the household, not in the thousands of people gathering. There we go.
That's good. That's so good. So that actually is the goal. I mean, Intrepid Impact Leadership, that's exactly what we want to do. We want business leaders to understand that faith is a huge component of that. Whether you think it is or not, faith is a huge component of leadership. And of course, you can't have people without leadership, and you can't have a business without people. So I think, Steve, that was an excellent intersection of everything we're doing here. So yeah, I think you used the term, what did you say, nerd or something like that? Nerd out? Well, nerd out all day on this channel, sir, because that is exactly what I want them to know. That's wonderful. Excellent. And so you kind of touched on this. It sounds like you've already answered the next question. That is, what are you most passionate about? But I think you detailed that. You want to expand on it any, or personally?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think I'm passionate about a number of things, which I guess you're probably already aware. But I think the biggest thing for me was to go, how do I, if I'm going to be a follower of Christ, how do I try and make my life and the principles and the patterns by which I lead and build and grow, how do I take to the very best of my ability the principles, methodology that Jesus used, so that if I'm supposed to be a follower who imitates, or in the old days, walk in the dust of my rabbi, there should be enough, not just in what I say, but what I do and the principles by which I live my life, that people will be able to convict me of being a follower of Jesus. So words are not enough. Is there enough in my actions and in the decisions I make and the principles I live by and the way that I lead organizations, that people can legitimately go, oh, I see how you've tried to assume Jesus was better at this than we are. And I joke and say, when Jeremy and I started the business, we went, let's assume Jesus was better at creating transformational change in ordinary people that lasted, and equipping them to experience the change and multiply it into the lives of others without the need for expensive consultants. So if he was doing things that we're not, let's assume he was right.
Yeah.
And if we're doing things he wasn't, let's assume he was right.
Yeah. Yeah.
Which was really interesting when it came to one-on-one executive coaching, by the way, because you always have to ask the question, which is to go, I can't see Jesus in the New Testament's primary model of developing leaders was one-to-one. Actually, all of what he did was he developed a group of leaders as a group, as the 12. There were subsets of it. So we always then ask the question, well, hang on, is this just something we've missed? Or potentially have we been more influenced by the culture of our day, which is very much in an individualistic culture, a therapeutic culture, a counseling, confessional culture? Because in the end, I always say to people, you tell me the examples in the New Testament where Jesus did his discipleship and coaching and training one-to-one, and none of them were anything other than chance encounters, or where he responded to individuals in the moment who sought him out, whether it's Nicodemus who came at night, or the woman at the well, or Peter on the beach. So that was a really big one for us, Jerry, of going, it's not, I don't think Jesus did one-to-one. I'm sure he took them away if there was a particular, maybe pastoral issue that had come up in the group discussion or in the teaching. But we couldn't get away from the fact Jesus taught and developed people in groups, not as individuals. So that's one example of where really we tried to allow his principles of how he did leadership, life, and grew his influence. How do we try and be faithful to that in the way we did it?
Yeah, that's excellent. And I of course knew some of the background of GiANT, but I never realized how overtly intentional you were in that model as your goal and the scalability factor. I love that. That's fascinating.
But I think the other thing we did, Jerry, was realize that actually in the world we live in today, you have to earn the right for influence. And whether we like it or not, people love Jesus, but they often have a trouble with the church, and Christianity over the years has caused difficulties in other parts of the world. So in a sense, what we did was we said, the principles are brilliant. How do we remove the Christianese that means these tools can't be used anywhere except in a church Christendom mindset. So here's the thing: we find that people love the principles of Jesus. And if you stay with Jesus, you can go anywhere, because effectively we're not actually associated. People love Jesus, the leader. He's left an incredible impact on the world. Most of the world faiths see that Jesus was a prophet or a messenger from God. That's certainly the Islamic, Judaism, or wise teacher. The only difference that causes more difficulty is when Christians say we think Jesus was more than a messenger or a prophet. He was actually the Son of God. So our thing has always been, let's assume that actually the principles of Jesus make people's lives better. And that actually, if we start with Jesus, the teacher and the leader, then everyone gets to play, because, in your world and mine, you can't just go into education and government and all the other spheres of culture, because there is a sensitivity to the fact, well, not everyone believes the same thing. So, Jeremy and I have been always say, if we have to hide our faith, then something's gone wrong. But actually, GiANT is not a Christian company that is evangelistic in that way. There we go. Dog disappearing again. But what we are doing is saying we're unashamedly ourselves. And we work with people of all faiths and none. And we work with companies in different parts of the world. And, I think they respect the honesty and the integrity, which says, look, this is who we are. GiANT is really a codification of our struggles over the years to do life well. And when things go badly, we try and go, how can we help others make different mistakes from the ones we've already made? And in a sense, as I said to you before, we just signed the contracts, I think, for me to go and deliver the Ramadan lecture for the King of Abu Dhabi, and who basically is looking at empowering leadership as the theme for the Ramadan lectures this year. Well, they don't mind that I'm a Christian, but they will mind if I'm culturally insensitive in how I communicate those things. We're going to go on a tour of the Grand Mosque and and that's the bit which for me I love, because in a sense, when we as believers say Jesus is what we can agree on, we're never going to agree on everything that the church has done or that is done in the name of religion. And that's the same for Islam, Judaism. So you can any of the major faiths, and sometimes we often, I think, project onto that's what Islam is, or that's what a Muslim is, but we don't like it when they go, well, if that's Christianity, the Crusades or the wars in various parts of the world, then we're not as excited about you. So Jesus seems to be something we can agree on, and leadership is something that everyone agrees the world needs right now.
Yes. That's excellent. And that's my stance on it as well. I from time to time in workshops and even, of course, on the show here, reference scripture intentionally. But even when I'm explaining a voice order, I may reference a scripture because it might just be top of mind. But like you said, if you're culturally sensitive, then you can do that in a very acceptable way, and you don't lose your influence in the process.
I think the thing is, you always say to people, you have to earn trust. And trust comes with being a person of character, being somebody people like, and they like being around, but you've also got to be highly competent at what you do. And your competence has to be incredibly relevant to the particular issue or challenge the individual or the team or the organization is facing. No amount of any other veneer gets around that initial need to be exceptionally good at what you do. And I think that's another piece of the thing which hopefully is at the heart of GiANT, and going, we work incredibly hard to be the best in the world at what we do. And that's kind of, it doesn't always show, but it takes a lot of effort, by the way, to make the complex simple without making it simplistic. So, for example, I love geeking out on, executive MBAs and PhD programs. And I love the fact that a lot of people do those. But I always go, guys, in order to get validated by you, I have to write in a vocabulary that nobody understands, reference it in a way that means no one will ever read it, in order to be validated by you, the academy. Well, we're the other way around. We're basically saying, how do we create the toolkit for the 99.999% of people that are just trying to get by today, make the relationships work a little bit better at home in their work, in their team. And I go, I may not have all the PhDs some people do, but from a purely market positioning, I'd rather aim at the 99.999% that are trying to say, Steve, if you can help me do relationships better, if you can help our team perform, and ultimately, as you know, we start there, but a lot of the leaders we work with end up going, oh my goodness, this can help me with my marriage, or it can help me with my kids, or it can help me with the dysfunction that exists outside the power dynamic of work. I always say it's much harder to be a liberating leader at home than it is when I have positional authority because I pay people and they'll do what I tell them.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more. In fact, what came to mind was when I was in graduate school, so MBA, there was no support challenge matrix. There was no, I'll make sure viewers that we have that slide, but there was no, even in the class, I felt a competitive spirit to say things that were smart, whether I was getting an A or not. I always wanted to get an A. I probably got an A in most of them, but it was about sounding smart. It was almost like earning your spot at the table. And what I love about GiANT is they flipped that on its head so well with these tools.
It would be nice to be thought of as very, very clever. And I think the thing is, people like you always help me. People say, who validates all the work you do? And I say, well, I get emails or LinkedIn messages every single day. People just saying, you created this tool, or that made a difference in my world. And I go, do you know, that's probably enough for me. Because in the end, one of the things we discovered was the world that we now live in, that kind of move from industrial to digital, the speed and pace of life and the way people learn changed. People don't read anymore. I mean, geeks like us still do, but the vast majority of people don't read anymore. Books are marketing tools and credibility positioning. Don't ever think you're going to sell hundreds and hundreds of thousands of books anymore. Well, unless you're writing a book like Prince, whatever is dissing the royal family in Britain, but that's another story. We won't go there. But fundamentally, what the world now is visual, it's interactive, and it demands immediate application. And we found, Jerry, is that if we could build tools that educated 13-year-olds could understand, use, and teach to their friends, then it would actually have the capacity to scale inside the new world of basically 365, 24/7 work, where people are pretty much overwhelmed most of the time. Because unless the tool is something you can take with you and use immediately, it doesn't matter how brilliant the intellect of the person facilitating the course or the training, whatever it might be. It largely is an irrelevance, because the moment you turn back on your email or walk out the door and the phone goes, the tsunami of information coming your way means by the time you get home, you've completely forgotten the really helpful stuff that was spoken to you, usually in the room. Yeah. If you've got one tool, so like the support challenge matrix that you described, it's not complicated in terms of what's there. And if I put it up on the screen here now, find it in our little toolkit that you can see here, this is it. I mean, somebody goes, this is a tool that you could mine for the rest of your life and never run out of energy. Can you learn to calibrate high support and high challenge for those you lead, to create a culture of empowerment and opportunity where they get to be the best they can be and get stretched beyond what they would normally do? We call that liberating leadership. Well, that's not difficult to actually understand. But any one of us who's tried to do it consistently, day in, day out, over time, with different personalities and different wirings, it's not as easy as it looks. But if people know what they're aiming for and what their tendency is, I tend to be higher on challenge than support. So when I'm accidental, I often create this dominating experience because I'm so determined that we win. I forget that actually not everyone's wired like me. Some of you are highly protective. You support is everything. You struggle to bring challenge, but the reality is people get entitled over time. They assume you're going to care for them and do all the work, and mistrust kicks in because you don't always clarify your expectations clearly. So, I'm not going to teach the tool completely, but it's just an example to those listening going, here's a toolkit you'll never forget because you can see it. It's got colors, it's got a few words in it, and we're good to go. But my educated 13-year-old understands it, uses it, teaches it to her friends. Therefore, we've created scalability. While I go on, why did Jesus speak in parables? In the New Testament, a third of Jesus' reported words are in parables. Now, I don't believe he spent a third of his teaching ministry teaching parables, What I believe is he taught using the artifacts of the culture of his day, which were stories. And the stories he told usually were about things in everyday life, very much an agricultural, sort of economy. So therefore, there's a load of stuff about scattering seed and blah, 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 all of which is Jesus, I think, applying the same principles, which are, how do I tell a story that people remember in an oral tradition, using easily accessible visual icons that connect principles that are deeply profound to something which is actually easy to remember. So how do you be simple enough that a child can understand, but without becoming simplistic that it loses its power? That's one of the things that I always challenge every leader to think, what is it that's in you? And how do you create the way that other people can learn from, I guess, your superpowers or your expertise? Jesus was the best at it, but he wouldn't have used parables in the same way if he'd been in 21st century America or Europe.
Yeah. I've always said, or not always said, someone told me this, and I've always believed that it's true, is that our job as, Christ followers, Christ bearers, is to be, in my case, the Jerry flavored Jesus. So, like you said, it should be obvious that I'm a Christ bearer. And if it's in the way that I have, like we say in GiANT, is leadership behaviors are defined by nature, nurture, choice. Well, so should our faith, I think, also. And bringing that, I love talking about the shattering the glittering image and that certified jail inspector piece I do. All of that is intentional to hopefully drop the guard of people that may be like, who's this guy? He's got a pocket silk in his shirt. Like, what is he doing, right? Hopefully we can drop the guard. I'd love for you to tell the viewers your biggest aha with both deployment of the 5 voices and the tools as well.
Gosh, there's a good question. So I'm a pioneer connector, which basically means I love to win. I'm highly strategic. I'm very, very charming when I want something. And I have this incredible capacity to align people, systems, and strategy to deliver outcomes that most people think are impossible. So that's kind of a little pen sketch. Jerry, you can send them a link so they can go and take the voice assessment. But the biggest aha for me when I first started studying what's it like to be on the other side of me, was that actually the biggest aha for me is whenever anyone gives me an idea or a thought, or let alone a business model, my default pattern is to go, I bet I can make this better with you. So I'm a collaborator by nature. I always inherently believe that whatever you're doing at the moment could be better. But I thought my desire to collaborate would be received with the intent of generosity with which it expressed. But what it turned out was that actually often what my first attempt to collaborate felt like critique. It felt like I was saying to you, what you've already done is not good enough. I think it's wrong. I disagree. So my aha was actually on the other side of me. It feels like I'm being critical when all I'm trying to do is collaborate and help make it better. So that'd be one example of where I had to change my behaviors, because I'm wired to be a troubleshooter, a kind of a natural way of problem solving. That's part of my superpower. I always see the way things can be better for people. But I had to learn that actually if I just brought that unfiltered without a level of self-awareness and a lens, in the end, it was not received the way I wished and hoped that it would be. So intent is not enough. Actually, the reality was people felt I was critiquing and harsh when it wasn't my intent at all. So that was one pioneer lens. If you want another one, it turns out that whenever I go to any team meeting or anywhere, to be quite honest, I dress in full battle fatigues and carry a grenade launcher as my chosen weapon of intellectual dispute. So before I know it, somebody would say something and I would go, or they'd wind me up, or they'd be incompetent, or they'd waste time, all the things which just drive me up the wall, or highly opinionated and wrong. And I would just go thump and basically blow them up. And I thought that was quite fun. But it turns out it then meant nobody really wanted to be honest to me, because the only people who would disagree with me were other pioneers who carried their own grenade launchers and Kevlar body armor. And we just go thump, thump, and we'd have a big fight. And it was great. It was like intellectual jousting. but I only heard the opinions of about 7% of the world's population, who happen to, on the whole, usually agree with me. So that was another massive moment in my own journey of self-awareness that went, if I want to hear all the other voices, I have to create an environment where actually I put a safety on my grenade launcher, and critically, when it comes to contribution in team, I go last, which is so difficult for me because I've usually been thinking about strategy for weeks. I know what the answer is, or at least I thought I used to. And then we come to the meeting. Anyone got an idea better than this one? No, good, let's execute. Versus now going, actually, I listen to all the other voices. I value the voices that are very different to mine. And I realize that actually my superpower, when it's deployed for the good of the whole, is incredibly powerful because everyone gets to bring their best when they feel safe. But if I misbehave or I'm accidental, Jerry, or I've had a bad day, I still have a grenade launcher, and it's like a little, even if it's only a mini grenade, everyone on the GiANT team will tell you at some point when they've been in a moment of weakness, turn around and go, even if it's only a little one, it still causes, and I've had to apologize immediately and pick up the pieces. So there's two or three obvious ones for me where knowing myself has allowed me to try and lead myself a bit better.
Well, I love that you used yourself as an example for one, of course, shattering the glittering image. But here's what I've noticed, like, my approach is often, with a concept of winning, both qualitative and quantitative. So most of my clients are similar voice order as yourself. So I think, they're probably watching. So if that's the case, and that's a great example for them to follow. So I'm so glad you did that. And shattering the glittering image, you've touched on it. Do you feel comfortable giving a specific example of when you were humbled the most, or what do you think?
Oh gosh, I mean, anyone who listens to me teach, it's not difficult, Jerry. I think the most humbled probably was the place of greatest pain. So for example, I'd never failed at anything. And at 30, I was like, I was pastor for youth and children of a really lovely church, and, really loved that, and ended up being involved in helping a friend who had a bit like a Nicky Cruz kind of character who'd come to faith out of literally nowhere. And he'd always had a vision for the nightclub culture he'd left behind. Mm. And I still remember him when he literally had this road to Damascus conversion, brought all the podium dancers from his nightclub to our church. And we were Willow Creek sort of seeker sensitive in those days. And I remember picking them up from the station. And I would often go and stand next to his DJ booth at this nightclub in Manchester, which was just not particularly pleasant. And of course, the dancers were not wearing a vast amount. And I'd have to try and shake them by the hand because they all knew me now as the pastor, and try not to look and keep looking at eye level.
Right.
And he said, Steve, they're never going to come. And so there was born, he said, Steve, I think the Lord's called me to open a nightclub, go and share our lives with them. And I think he's called you to do it with me. And I went, Cameron, you've got to be joking. I hate nightclubs, never been to nightclubs. I'm training to be, I'm a pastor already. I will go and talk to the Lord about it. And if he, literally, if there's a road to Damascus, I will do it. Anyway, long story short, it really was a sense of calling. And I didn't know anything of the Jedi mind tricks I know now. We basically raised, close to $1 million from about 126 families in our church, Baptist church, Jerry, teetotal, most of them, who put up the initial capital to open a bar nightclub in central Manchester, which was called Ascension. My job was to recruit people to be part of the staff team and raise money. And I was very persuasive. I mean, looking back now, I know why it worked. I think a lot of the grandparents were so worried about their teenagers and their nightclub scene that they saw Cameron as this incredible evangelist to this generation. And I still believe he was. But here's the problem. The due diligence on the financial business model was nowhere near as robust as the work we did on the missional model. So we opened a huge, largest bar nightclub. I think it was 2000 and gosh, what would it have been? 2002. And actual revenues were a lot less than had been projected from day one. And we owed money to a lot of interesting characters. They got rid of, after about 2 months, the management team. They put me in as the managing director of this thing. And I remember saying, guys, I've never led a business in my life. And they said, look, right now, that's not what we need. We need someone who's going to face up to creditors, buy us time, go to banks, go to the people who owe money. And for 10 months, and they said, we'll give you a guy who's just retired as one of the sort of COO, I think, of one of the FTSE companies. And he's a Christian guy. He spent a day and a half a week with me, Jerry, for 10 months trying to make this business break even. My conclusion is, unless you're laundering drug money or selling drugs as well, it's really hard to make nightclubs work. And of course, we were there as trying to be an example, trying to be in the midst of the culture. We won awards from the police, we won awards from the drug agencies, we had all the issues that nightclubs deal with. But the majority of the staff there were actually Christians who would pray for people, make sure they got home safely. But in the end, the business never really broke even at all. So people were threatening to shoot me and the kids, and every week I had to go to church on Sunday, having had the numbers of the night before, to know that I didn't have enough money to pay all the bills yet again. And that journey of that 10 months, then administration, so Chapter 11, and then on to liquidation and settling up. I did the most expensive Kingdom MBA ever devised. I think it cost about $2 million in the end. And I had to deal with very, very public failure, not because we'd done anything wrong, but because in a sense, the dream we'd given a lot of our lives for didn't happen. And, we didn't really understand spiritual warfare, perhaps the way we did now. Look at the fact that basically we just thought because Jesus called us to go into that world, that it should be okay. And realized we were entering the enemy's territory, and we just assumed it would be handed over to us. And the thing that was most sad in some ways, of all the money that went in, 3 months after the nightclub closed, it reopened as a lap dancing bar, which the enemy effectively is going, look, all that money, all that effort, all that energy. So that was one of the most difficult pieces. So in a sense, I would say nobody I know has had to go through, when you fail publicly, not morally, but it was just a really difficult moment. Actually, in the end, the things I learned from that means that I don't fear failure in the same way. Actually, it was God's grace in that was amazing. And I don't tell a lot of people this story anymore, by the way, because it's 20 years ago. But people often go, how do you know so much about business and people? And it was because in the end, all I've done is I've tried to use the experiences of life, the good ones and the bad ones, and go, how can I take what I've learned and make it available to other people? And I think in the midst of that, somebody says, see, we're going to pay for you to go and study something. And it turns, okay, well, I've got nothing else on. And I went and vowed I would study with all my heart, soul, mind, and strength that I'd never done before. And 20 years on, Yoda or whatever you want to call me now, there's probably not many who are as good at understanding why people behave the way they do, but also hopefully it's not stuck in a PhD tome somewhere. It's actually available to ordinary people to be able to use in the ordinariness of their relationships, and hopefully be a bit more self-aware than I was in those early years. And so there you go. When you ask, have I failed at anything? That would be the most obvious example of, 20 years ago, but it still shaped me. But it hasn't ended me. In fact, it's made me stronger. I failed. I don't fear failure in the same way I used to. I kind of see it as an opportunity for growth. And you Americans are really cool at this because you never really trust entrepreneurs that haven't gone bust at least a couple of times. So I always say I'm an American in exile in Britain with a British passport.
You certainly are. Yes, sir. Absolutely. I love that story, folks. And that's what we're talking about when we say shatter the glittering image. You're not all the letters after your name. You're not your resume. You're not your LinkedIn profile. In fact, those experiences that brought you the most learning opportunities are probably the very thing that can make you so influential, just like Steve has shared. I've had similar situations, and sometimes I like to tell people that, we could usually tell you what not to do better than we can tell you what to do. So that's a great example. I'm really glad you shared that.
I'm sure you are. I hate it. It's always good listening to other people's failures, Jerry. So, yeah.
Oh my goodness. You know what? That may be somewhat true there, my friend.
It's my trouble is that when people see me now, they see this larger than life, lover of life, highly successful, blah, 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 founder of this global company, huge adoration from a lot of people that just go, Steve, you know, it would be really easy for me sometimes to look like somehow life had been this perfect, you know, beautiful family, blah, 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 beautiful kids, beautiful wife, all those things. When I tell them the stories, it's actually usually as a pioneer, it makes me far easier to listen to.
Oh, good. Oh, yes, yes.
Oh, wow. Okay. So, oh, well, you haven't had it all easy. And it's one of those ones where you just go, that's been part of the story. And I think sometimes it's not, you know, the more people try and make me their sort of this figure on a stage or affirmation, which is you do incredibly well, it's almost like I have to keep telling the stories of me getting it wrong, because it means that it's easier for people to go, oh, you're not just one of those. You're actually somebody who, I like shattering the glittering image or something.
Image, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So I mean, I have never had that phrase before, but I try really hard to do it. If you ever hear me teach, I'm always the idiot in my stories.
Oh,
because
absolutely.
in some ways it
Yes.
allows people in, you know. And so for me, I try and go, Lord, you know, I've been given a platform for influence which is growing all the time. But it's really important you don't believe your own publicity. And it's also really important that you remain highly accountable. And in some ways, you know, was it no temptation to seize you except that which is common to man? But the promise is at that moment, the Lord will always provide you a way out. So I think, you know, I thought it would get easier as I got older, Jerry, to be holy. My conclusion is it seems to get harder. And the more ability you have to provide for your own well-being, and the more resource and the more adulation you get, the harder it is to be actually dependent day by day for daily bread. You know, when I was a pastor, I was highly dependent for daily bread because in Britain they don't pay you anything. Whereas all of a sudden I go, do you know, I've probably got more than daily bread now. I've got a granary and I've got a bakery which churns it out. And so how do I make sure that actually in that generosity, but also it's not mine? That's my other thing. And so people just go, do you know, I'm maybe a steward of this, but it's really easy to believe sometimes it's like, hey, it's my genius that created Five Voices, or me and Jeremy together created all these things. And I go, do you know, the moment you start to believe your own publicity is usually the moment when you need to be careful, because all of it is on trust. All of it is for a period of time. And you know, one day we will all have to give an account for what it is that we've done. And I always say to people is, you have to begin with the end in mind. You have to know what you're aiming for. And that helps you make better decisions in life today. So for me, I would say that basically, you know, what's your dream? What's your vision? What are you working towards? I say, I'm always working towards the 85-year-old Steve who's dying, knows he's dying, is more than happy to be dying, but is still well enough for a couple of months that anybody who wanted to come and say goodbye in person could. So how many people's lives would I have impacted to the extent that which they would get on an airplane or a plane or drive, not send me an email or a text, but actually would come and say goodbye with the stories of you may never know, but the thing you said or the thing you wrote or the time you invested or the things you believed about me, whether they were in my 3, 12, 72 or crowds, how many lives would I have been significant enough that they'd want to come and say goodbye? So that's the kind of, now, is that arrogant? I don't know. I don't think so. But that's the reason why I keep going every day. How am I investing? How am I being obedient enough to be available, to be intentional about who am I multiplying life into? And that's really the, you know, I think that's one of the challenges a lot of leaders have to deal with. It's one thing to be successful, and it's one thing to be recognized for the expertise of what you do. But I always challenge people to go, most people die with the real gold in the coffin because they never learned to multiply it into the lives of other people. So I'm always interested in looking at who has created effectively people who've learned how to do what they do and then hopefully go on and do greater things. So that's another piece for me, which I'll always be about, which is how do I use what God's given me and multiply it so that actually it compounds over time rather than just dies with me.
I love that. That's excellent. And I'll repeat what you said. Most people die with the gold still in the coffin. I believe that's what you said.
Yeah.
That's so important, because if you don't take the time to realize your gifts and then share that with the world and help others do the same, then who is going to come see you on your deathbed there? That's a good.
Well, we spend a lot of time doing financial planning and inheritance planning,
Yeah.
but we don't actually plan what to do with the unconscious competence which allowed us to be successful in the first place. And that's one of those pieces of going, how do you create multiplication rather than just a financial legacy? And, that's you said, what am I passionate about? I'm pretty passionate about a lot of things, but that's another one that I always say, hey guys, the real mark of leadership that will last is when you've learned to multiply what it is that God's given you into the lives of other people. And if you think it has to be highly talented people, you obviously haven't read the New Testament. Because Jesus took some very ordinary people and basically equipped them with a toolkit and a knowledge and insight that actually over time allowed them to change the Roman world. And I would argue that it looked like it had failed spectacularly when he reached the end of his life. He didn't write a book or get a PhD. He didn't travel that far, but what he left as a legacy in the lives of the people whose lives he's touched. So I would say to leaders, if I look at your phone, your calendar and your email history, I should know who your 3, 12, and 72 are. Because if you're not intentional with your time, then basically it will go towards the people who shout the loudest or the ones that basically are most demanding. And you have to be prepared to recognize you can't give everybody everything they want. Yeah. Jesus had favorites, which for feelers is really hard, Jerry, because in a sense, surely everyone is equal in the way that the value that they are as people. And I go, that's true. But you're not telling me that the crowds didn't fancy being in the 72 didn't fancy being in the 12, or the 9 didn't fancy being in the 3. They were still human beings. And Jesus chose to invite people into different orbits of relationship with him. So that's another bit that for me is, I've really tried hard to work out how do I do that well, because that's costly, by the way. You don't need to do that. It's kind of, they always want more time than you have, and they always cost more money than you think they should, to actually apprentice people to be able to do what you do. But the reward lasts a lot longer, is my experience.
That's right. That's excellent. Well, Steve, this has been an amazing show, and I'd love for the viewers to know, how can they find you? What's the best way?
Well, being a Brit, so LinkedIn's probably the easiest one, just Steve Cockram, and I lose track of the links, and I'm sure Jerry will give you those. But if that's the easiest place to reach out to me, my personal email, for those of you who've got this far and listened, is just steve@giantworldwide.com. So steve@giantworldwide.com. That doesn't go through any filters. That will come direct to me. So if you've listened, found it interesting, I always say that at my level of leadership, I should have time, because if I haven't got time, then my calendar's too busy. So if any of you are brave enough to find out your voice and then basically reach out and say, Steve, I'd love 20 minutes, I will find a way to get you on my Calendly link. So there you go. If you know your voice and you reach out and tell me what it is on LinkedIn or email and say, I would love 20 minutes of your time, I will send you my Calendly link. So there you go.
That's excellent. See, and folks, I'm just going to say Steve has probably been one of the most generous with his time, with not only people that he doesn't necessarily know that well, because that's how we got to know each other, as he was sharing his time, but also with sharing the insights that he's learned and working with hundreds, maybe even the thousands now of leaders around the world. So take him seriously. We have the assessment there on the website as well. But I'd love for you to connect with him and perhaps develop a friendship as I have. Steve, it's been such an honor to have you today. Thanks so much for your time.
Pleasure, Jerry. Thank you for all the work you do. And I love that intersection of faith, leadership, and business. It's probably the sweet spot that I aspire to live in.
Thanks so much. Everyone, I appreciate your time. This has been another Intrepid Impact Leadership Show. We'll see you next time.
82% of team members feel misunderstood or undervalued. So this is exactly where I like to be, teaching, communicating, helping others, realizing their aspirations. I'm so excited about shattering the glittering image and uncovering the truth about you.